Canada, but has practiced in Canada, USA and UK, and is now currently Principal Children and Families Social Worker for Medway Council. So we've touched on this in little elements as we've gone through the morning, but Laurie's going to explore for us around vicarious trauma. So I'm just going to hand straight over to you, if that's all right, Laurie.
Yes, thank you. I caught the tail end of Sarah's presentation, and I think we're kindred spirits in so many things that she said. I came in on the part about talking to their staff about trauma that they experience, coming from a place of hope, trying to help people find hope. Also about people not going to training, who should be going to training and thinking they know it all. So many things, I think, probably throughout the rest of the day will culminate in what I'm going to talk about today. Are you able to see the presentation?
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay, fabulous. So I've been a social worker for 27 years, and my first job was in secure residential for teenagers, mostly those who had committed sexual offenses, those with serious mental health issues. And the ethos of the organization I worked for was, this is the most difficult job you will ever have, but we are going to hold you so that you can hold those kids. And they absolutely did that. Every time there was a serious incident, they brought counselors in, not just for the staff on the unit where the young people lived, but for the whole organization, because it was a real community. From there, I moved back home to Canada, worked for a homeless shelter for teens, and they had a similar ethos. This is the toughest job you ever do. We will hold you so you can hold these kids. And again, they absolutely did. Now, I've been in the UK for 17 years, and I've worked solely in children's my whole career. And in those 17 years, I've never had any experience where I've been held, I think. There's not been debriefings, there's not been real support around any serious incidents. I've had babies on my caseload die, and there really wasn't a lot of support around that. So I suppose my interest in secondary trauma comes from my amazing first experience in the job and thinking that's actually how it should be. Now, 27 years later, that organization has its own in-house trauma team to support staff because, like Sarah was saying, the stuff we see and hear every day is traumatic, and we can't not be affected by it. It just is. So this is a new slide I've added because normally when I do this training, there are people who are experiencing secondary trauma, but it's not going to be the whole group at the same time. But we are living through a collective trauma. The whole world is living through this trauma of COVID in the past 18 months. So we're all in that same storm, the COVID storm, but we are experiencing it very differently. Some of us have lost loved ones. Some of us have been sick ourselves. Some of us have not seen people for 18 months, very isolating. So we're talking about this today in the context of all of us experiencing this collective trauma. If you hear a lot of noise in the background, I just got a puppy and I've tried to occupy him with something which he is throwing around the room. So apologies for that. So vicarious secondary trauma is also called vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. They have slightly different meanings, but for what we're going to talk about today, I'm just going to call them the same thing. And people who work with, listen to, and try to help children and adults who've experienced trauma are at great risk for internalizing this trauma. And the symptoms can be the same between primary and secondary trauma. And it occurs when we are exposed to the events experienced by another, not the ones experienced ourselves, experienced by another, whether we see it or we hear it, we read about it, and we can become overwhelmed by that trauma. And it can be our strong reaction, our grief, our rage, our outrage. So we read about someone abusing an elderly person or a child, and we get so angry that someone could do that. But it can also be our protective shell and our wish not to know. Because of what we see and hear every day, we build this shell around us that we no longer see what's normal and no longer see what's trauma. And that's when it becomes very dangerous for the people that we work with, because we are not acknowledging where they are, their trauma, we might be missing really important things. And it can come from repeated exposure or from a one-time event. So you could go into the office, you're feeling good, you got plans for the weekend, you're loving your job, and you see or hear something that really strikes you and just takes you aback, and you can experience trauma from that one event. And it's an occupational hazard. We talk about occupational hazards, say if you're a firefighter or a police officer or a nurse, we know what the occupational hazards are of that. But does anyone really talk about the occupational hazard of being emotionally available for the people we work with? Maybe now, maybe in mental health, certainly not in my training as a social worker. I introduce it in all the training that I do, but I think that's probably pretty rare. And it's often seen as a deficit in us as individuals. You're a professional, you are struggling with the emotional impact of the work. It's something that's wrong with you, rather than this is what happens when you do this kind of work. It's an occupational hazard. I'm taking you through this as a whistle-stop tour. It's usually a 3 or 4 hour session, so this is half an hour. I'm going to send a resource for you that is longer, that goes into some of this in more detail. So what increases risk? The first thing is empathy, and I think empathy is our greatest tool as practitioners. It is our ability to get alongside people, to say, I am here with you through this pain. I'm willing to walk alongside you. Lay it on me, lay your burdens on me. But the more we do that, the more we open ourselves up to the people we are serving, the more at risk we are. And I'm not suggesting that we not be empathetic, because again, that is absolutely our greatest tool. Just be mindful that our greatest tool also puts us at great risk. Insufficient recovery time. We are working with people in often their most difficult situations, whether it's mental health, whether it's child protection, whether it's end of life, people at their most difficult times. And we're hearing stories of trauma and loss and abuse every day. And given the funding and the shortages of staff and the shortages of resources, we are putting in a lot of long hours. Now, for some people over COVID, they've been able to get a better work-life balance. Most of the social workers I know are working even more hours because they're working from their home, their computer is always there, they're working on weekends, so we never have the space to turn off and recover from what we're hearing. And a lot of people who go into this line of work, we're kind of martyrs, and we keep giving and giving and giving until there's nothing left to give. Do feel free to put things in the chat while I'm talking, if you like. Otherwise, there'll be time for questions at the end. Unresolved personal trauma. Now, a lot of us got into this line of work because of our own experiences, and that can make us really good at what we do. But if we haven't addressed our own issues, they can be reactivated by our work with people, and that can result in us shutting people down. It might be you over-empathize with someone. For instance, if you've experienced domestic abuse and you're willing to talk about that, someone you're working with might start telling you their story, and you'll come back with, oh, when I was in that situation, this is what I did. And you've shut them down because you've made the story about you. Or they might start talking and you think, wow, that hits really close to home. I can't ask this next question because it's too close. I can't deal with it. Or you might not even know that you're not able to ask that question. You just move it on to the next thing without asking. So either way, we can shut down clients in what they need to tell us. Isolation, lack of boundaries, bringing trauma, abuse, and loss into our homes. There's a really poignant story from one of the social workers I work with who was writing a court report about horrific sexual abuse. She said, I'm sitting here in my living room and my 5-year-old daughter is playing 10 feet away from me, and I am writing about this horrific sexual abuse. And it is in my home. It is with my child. And I can't separate that because we're all working from home. So over the past 18 months, we've become increasingly isolated. Often even before this, we were quite isolated in our roles. I'm finding when I go to speak to other local authorities that we don't work as well in teams as we used to, not because people aren't willing to, but because the workload is so great that they're just keeping their heads down and doing their own work. We don't have the boundaries that we had previously, where you drive to work and then you drive home and you get up every hour or so to get a cup of tea or something. Everything is just blurring into one. So a good helpful hint from someone was they start their morning working at home by going outside, walking around the block, and then starting their workday. And then at the end of the workday, they walk around the block the other way, and that's the end of their workday. They've put away their computer and they've set those boundaries. What increases risk? One of the things is the lack of systemic resources. Now, I'm sure in mental health and in domestic abuse, certainly in children's services, there has been a considerable lack of investment, austerity over the past 10 years. I'd say for children's, there is a waiting list of about 100 children who are waiting for secure placement nationally. And that means we can't get them the place that might best help them. We have to put them in places that can't meet their needs. That means that they could be further traumatized. It means they could be further criminalized. And it causes us moral injury. That's a term I came across about 6 months ago, when we have to make decisions that sit against our values because it's the only choice we can make. This certainly happened to medical staff over COVID, where they were having to decide who could get treatment and who wasn't. If you're more likely to survive, you get treatment. If you're probably going to die, well, then you don't. Moral injury. And then those who are new to the profession or long serving. Those who are new to the profession probably haven't built up the boundaries, the networks, everything that they are working with is usually for the first time. Their first serious case of domestic abuse, their first death of a child, their first sectioning of someone, whatever it is, everything is new. So there's that stress added to what they're experiencing. And then long-serving staff. So some of you will have been in the profession longer than I have at 27 years. But if you think how many people's stories of abuse and loss and trauma have we heard in all of those years? Hundreds, if not thousands of stories. And that starts to build up if we don't let things go. But also, even if we let them go, I mean, I still remember vividly some of the kids I first worked with 27 years ago, not just for bad things, but because I'm going to say the word, I love them. I love them like they were my little brothers. And I still remember them all this time later. But that doesn't mean that those in the middle aren't at risk. It can happen to any of us, but those two things, beginning your career and long serving, does put you at greater risk. And then COVID, we are all experiencing, again, this collective trauma. We are trying to go out and help people while we might be helping our own families, when we might be experiencing loss ourselves. All of that is having an impact in creating a greater risk for us. So how does it affect you as a person? Well, in so many ways. I won't go through all of these, but loss of meaning, powerlessness, guilt, helplessness, depression, being withdrawn or moody, sleep disturbances, eating problems, losing meaning in life, anger with God, withdrawing from other people. It has a huge impact on us as people, first and foremost. And then it affects us as professionals. It might mean we decrease the quality and the quantity of our work. We might have low motivation, withdrawing from colleagues, staff conflicts, hostile teams, sickness, absenteeism, exhaustion. All of these things affect us. So you think us as a person, how that's affected us as a professional, and then we move on to the impact on our organizations. So there's a high cost of recruitment due to high turnover rates. There's lost time due to increased sickness rates. And usually when someone is off sick, even long term, we aren't able to backfill those posts. So that means the rest of the team picks up the slack They become increasingly stressed, they may go off, and it's just a big ripple effect. There may be team and organizational instability, low job satisfaction and motivation, increased likelihood of mistakes, and hostile and unhealthy work environments. So how does all of that affect the people that we work with? Well, an overwhelmed helper is minimally effective at best and harmful at worst. We can do harm. And Sarah said earlier, we are causing harm to our clients every day, not because we're horrible people, not intentional harm, but we can cause harm. And people we work with might be attuned to our distress, and that may mean they don't tell us what they need to tell us. Could be we have a good relationship with them and they don't want to cause us further stress, so they don't tell us what they need to. Or it could be they see we're falling apart, and why would they tell us something if we can't even manage ourselves? And interestingly, the same thing applies to practitioners and their managers. When I speak to social workers and I say, wow, that's really stressful, that's really traumatic, have you spoken to your manager about it? They will often say, no, my manager is so stressed, I couldn't possibly add to that stress for them. Or, have you met my manager? There's no way I'm telling them. What are they going to do for me? So it affects not just the people we work with, but if you're a manager, it is probably affecting your practitioners as well. The people we work with will feel the effects of late appointments, canceled or forgotten visits, half-hearted attempts, and workers who just don't seem to care. And we have an impaired ability to make good assessments and plans, and that could have minor to serious implications. Our inability to effectively engage might be misconstrued as service users' lack of active engagement rather than us. And like I said before, we can minimize behaviors and concerns, downplay risks, and be unable to accurately assess what's happening for someone. I'm going to give you an example of where I think I was experiencing secondary trauma, but also primary trauma, because I was absolutely terrified of this father I was working with. And I went out on a visit and I knocked on the door and I knocked like this, knock, knock. Well, there was no chance in the world that anybody was going to hear that knock. But I waited a few minutes and I knocked again in the same way. Knock, knock. They didn't. They didn't answer. So I went back to the office and you know what I wrote in my case notes? Anyone want to shout out what I wrote in my case notes?
Nobody home.
Nobody home. I wrote these people, this family were not home for a scheduled child protection visit. And I put it on them and it was all on me. So did I cause harm? Yeah, I did. Did I cause huge life-changing harm? Probably not, but it is forever in this family's file that they did engage with a scheduled child protection visit. So anybody reading that would think, this family doesn't care about their children. They're not willing to engage. And it was all about me. And I had a manager at the time who I had gone to my first court hearing to remove a child. And it was the worst thing that I've ever done as a social worker, taking this 10-day-old baby from their parents to later be adopted. And after that court hearing on a Friday afternoon, I went to my manager on the Monday morning and said, this is the worst thing I've ever done. I know it had to be done, but I just feel so awful. And her response to me was, it's part of the job, get on with it. So I obviously wasn't going to that manager for the help I needed around working with this father, around my secondary and my primary trauma. And when we aren't available to our staff, those are the kinds of things that can happen. When we normalize trauma, we normalize, we pathologize feeling the emotional impact of our work, then our staff are going to experience that, and then our clients are going to experience that. So left unchecked, secondary trauma changes who we are and how we live. Now, I see in the chat there was someone who's a domestic abuse coordinator, and I had done this training for a domestic abuse team, and there was one woman in there who had been doing domestic abuse work for about 10 years. And she had ended all her relationships with male friends. She didn't date. She stopped going to church because the pastor was a man, and her relationship with her brothers and father had started to disintegrate because men are abusive. All men abuse women, so why would I have any interaction with them? And over the years she had been doing this, it had completely changed who she was and how she interacted with the world. Now, I know she went on to get therapy after that, but she had gotten to the point where it had done that much damage to her. And there's, when you get these slides, there's a link to the video there. It's a 20-minute TED Talk, and it is excellent. And it talks about things like that. It's very hopeful. There's a lot of humor in it that that will resonate with you. But if you do have time and you want to know more, 20 minutes well spent. I've watched it over 100 times and I pick up something new every time. But if we don't address this, it changes who we are and how we live. Okay, so that was all really depressing. And it's even more depressing in the whole 3 hours because we spent about an hour and a half on it. So why do you do what you do? Is it the money? The prestige? The power? The chance to be on the front page of the Sun? Why in the world would you do it? Okay, someone wants to help. Yes, absolutely. Help. For some people, it's a fulfillment of our faith and our spirituality. Every day is different. We like the challenge. We want to support people. We want to see people go on to live their best life. We like working with our teams. Anything that helps us have satisfaction in our work, really important that we don't lose sight of that. And also those small things. So when I worked in the shelter, my idea of success would have been that every teenager had a home, safe, clean home to live in, and they were either in school or work. I'd still be waiting all this time. So success started being, Billy came in last night and she had a hot meal. Billy came in and she stayed overnight, so I knew she wasn't sleeping on the street. And then the next time she came in, she saw the nurse. Now, those don't seem like big things to most people, but for Billy, they were huge. And we built on all of those things. So we celebrated together. And those little things, were wonderful. And they're the things that keep many of us in the job, those little steps for us that are huge steps for the people that we work with. So think about the last time you were on a plane and they're doing the safety demonstration and the oxygen mask. What do they say about the oxygen masks?
Put it on yourself first.
And why do you have to do that?
To make sure you're safe to be able to help everybody else.
Yeah, exactly. And for a lot of us in this field, we don't think about putting our oxygen mask on ourselves first. We are all about helping other people, whether that's our family and friends, whether that's our client. It's pretty much everybody except ourselves. So some of the things that can help mitigate secondary trauma. This isn't a cure for secondary trauma. This will help us to be in a better place to be able to deal with the emotional impact of our work. Physical, eat and sleep well. Well, that sounds like common sense, but when you're stressed, you're overworking, it's really difficult to do. There's more in the article about all of these things. Psychological, emotional well-being, spend time with people you like. We spend a lot of time with people we don't like, and I'm thinking particularly of social media and doom scrolling. Spiritual, and that doesn't necessarily mean organized religion. It could be, but if you're a member of a church, a temple, a mosque, and that's helpful and supportive, fantastic. But it might be yoga or mindfulness or walking out in the woods, something that connects you with the bigger world around you. And professional, ask for supervision. And if you aren't getting it, demand it because it is your right and it is best for you. It is best for the people we work with that there is good, reflective, supportive supervision. Take breaks. I usually ask, when was the last time you took half an hour away from your desk for lunch? And I say, anyone 5 days? Never anybody who took that 5 days. 4, 3, often it's 0. People aren't taking time away from their desk. They're not taking breaks at all. Team care. We know from, say, where I am in Medway, from our own surveys, that staff find their immediate manager and their team the most supportive aspect in their work. And that's also played out nationally in surveys. It is your immediate manager and team who provide the most support. So team care is vital. So what kinds of things do you do within your team? It might be fun things like quiz nights, or going out for lunch, or cakes for people's birthday, your WhatsApp group. It might be reflective supervision. It's checking on each other. It is sharing training and knowledge and support. It's all of those kinds of things. Again, those little things that make the difference. Now, both of those things, self-care is absolutely within our gift to do something about. Team care, most of that is within our gift to do something about. Even if you don't have a supportive manager, the rest of the team can still do things to take care of each other. But it isn't all about us. It's not all on us. So I'm going to say something perhaps controversial, and that is, I'm not a fan of the word resilience, because it seems to have come to mean that if you are struggling, that there's something wrong with you. Oh, that NQSW, that newly qualified social worker just isn't resilient. They just don't have what it takes. Actually, they've just dealt with this horrific case of domestic abuse. It is reasonable that they would be affected by that. It's not about resilience. So when I speak about resilience, I'm not talking about individual resilience. I'm talking about community or collective resilience. And this is where I think organizations have a huge responsibility. We know that secondary trauma is an occupational hazard of helping, but many organizations that deal with traumatized people operate out of this misguided notion that feelings are unprofessional and that struggling is a sign of personal weakness. And this kind of culture has a real impact on the worker, the team, the organization, the children, young people, and adults that we serve. So helping organizations must acknowledge the impact of secondary trauma and work to help and heal, protect their staff. And that means collective resilience rather than individual coping. So what does your organization have in place? Over the past 18 months, no, I've only been in Medway for a year, but I've been running a weekly support group, which started out as coping with COVID and now is just a weekly support group where people just can come in, leave their titles at the door, and be whoever they need to be, say whatever they need to say. And sometimes it's about work, sometimes it's personal. There's the employee assistance program. There's what happens in supervision. Is your manager supportive? There's the culture in your organization. Is it blaming? Is it finger wagging if things go wrong? If you are struggling, is someone saying you're not resilient? It's you as a personal deficit. What is happening in your organization? And our organizations have a vast responsibility to us as practitioners. If they want us to do our best for families, then they need to do their best by us. And this is a quote from Harriet Ferguson, and it's specifically about children, but it relates to adults just as much. And it's workers' state of mind and the quality of attention that they can give to children is directly related to the quality of support, care, and attention they themselves receive from supervision, from managers, and from peers. So again, how we hold our staff is how they can go out and hold the people that they work with. Now, if you're not being held in your organization, of course you can still go out and take good care of the people you're working with, but it comes at a real cost, and it's really not that sustainable for you to continue to do that. So our organizations need to hold us. And just one final quote, and that is, the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to walk through water and not get wet. This is an occupational hazard of helping. We are seeing people at their most difficult time. We are hearing stories of trauma and abuse and loss almost daily. We have to be thinking the worst possible things that could happen. But again, there's so much in what we do that brings joy for them, for us, and keeps us coming back. But it is an occupational hazard of helping. We are all going to experience this at least once in our career. So we need to be in organizations that will support us. We need to do the things that we can to take care of ourselves, the things that are within our gift to do. And going back again to what Sarah said about trauma-informed practice, that's not just about the people we work with. That is about us as organizations and how we work with each other and how we support our staff. So that is it, whistle stop tour, but if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. And also I'll send through the guide, and there's resources on the last page for you as well.
Thank you, Laurie. Again, that's been really thought-provoking. I think as a profession, as sectors, we think that we have to carry on, brave what you're dealing with, and keep walking through it. And if you do almost indicate that you're struggling a bit, it's almost seen on some occasions, not all occasions, as a bit of failure, because actually, you know, you've trained for this, and you need to sort yourself up and pull yourself up. So I think it's really, really thought-provoking. And I think it's something that probably, and maybe TSAB, maybe we'll feed this back to TSAB in terms of the partnership, in terms of how we're really looking at wellbeing for our staff, particularly through that that trauma lens. Because I think we do talk a lot about, you very right, Laurie, about resilience in inverted commas, and but I think that again places responsibility back onto individuals, doesn't it? And actually this is about organisations, and this is about how we as organisations and senior leaders actually really think about that secondary trauma for our staff. And obviously COVID has highlighted that significantly in terms of feeling isolated. So there's a huge amount in there that's very thought-provoking. I'm fully aware of the time, which isn't great because it's 1 o'clock, and I know people thought that we were ending at 1. So what I would ask is that if you have any questions for Laurie, please put them in the chat, and we will then have a conversation with Laurie about feeding back to everybody. I'm going to bring it to a close.